certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
The Claremont serial killer trial today came to a dramatic end, with the defence case over in a matter of minutes and Bradley Edwards confirming he would not take the stand. It's day 85 of Claremont in Conversation, and what a day it has been, with a bombshell moment in which the accused is also told to brace himself. We've got a full deck today. Natalie Bonjolo, Tim Clark, Alison Fan and Damien Cripps with you. Okay, so I think let's start at the start. Tim, it was a packed courtroom again, and today you had people lined up outside the door in the rain, busting to get in.
Yeah, apparently there was people outside the door before the court had even opened, before 9 o'clock, obviously very keen again to see what Mr. Edwards had to say for himself in his own words. I think some of them were disappointed yesterday because they actually maybe had misunderstood and thought Mr. Edwards was actually going to give evidence himself, but that wasn't the case. That was, as you said off the top, Nat, that was confirmed today that he won't be, because he was given the chance and declined as his right. But yeah, it was breakneck stuff today. There was all sorts going on, so we'll try and get through it all.
Yeah, there were twists and turns that really, nobody saw coming. So, Ali, let's start with the video picked up from yesterday, and this really started with questions to Mr. Edwards about his hobbies and his personal life again.
Absolutely. And again, he was just in this sort of very chatty conversational mood or response to do with his hobbies and what happened and his sports and so forth. And as we've said, it was only when the questions got more direct to the actual Claremont area, showing photographs and so forth, that he gave the one-word answers. But again, his whole demeanour I find completely puzzling.
It's interesting. Yesterday, Damien, Tim and Ellie were talking about Mr. Edwards and how he was quite open when he was asked about these personal questions. And Tim was talking about, these really private, intimate questions. But of course, when the questioning was about the accusations, he was quite closed and quite short. I mean, I guess, is that to be expected?
I think, Nat, in those situations where a person's giving an interview, it doesn't matter how much a police officer will explain to a person or how many times they've been told by a lawyer, how many times they might have seen something on TV. The situation can be quite overwhelming. I think when someone's sitting there, so it's quite difficult to draw the connection between what you might say about your personal life and how that may affect the way a jury or a judge might view you. I mean, if you can imagine you're sitting there in the interview room being interviewed, and I think as has been discussed, as was discussed yesterday, the interviewing techniques of the police are well versed. I mean, they know what they want to achieve, and they do it quite often, so they know how to get there. So one of the things you'll find with when personal questions are asked, people, quite generally speaking, people enjoy talking about themselves. So people will, what suburb are you from? Oh, right now I live in, Morley. Oh, where did your parents come from? And those kind of questions can really actually open up a person to just having a feeling that the interviewers are just generally having a conversation with them. And it's a technique that really, in my experience, catches people out all the time, because, as I think Tim mentioned yesterday, it opens the conversation. And so, in my experience, and I think it's generally speaking, it is something that the police can achieve, is get a personal conversation going with a person who's doing an interview.
Okay, so Tim, 13 hours since Bradley Edwards has been in custody, and Detective Marrapodi takes a break and returns to the interview, and he tells Mr. Edwards to brace himself. Can you talk to us about this and what you were seeing in the video?
Yeah. So we talked yesterday, and Damien can obviously talk to it a bit more, about the police officers have got to be able to be seen to be doing everything they can to make the suspect or the comfortable, in inverted commas, by offering him breaks, offering him sustenance, offering him, anything they can to show that they are doing their duty to care for, I suppose, an accused person. But on the other hand, they are there to do a job, and that is to ask him questions about the most serious crime that you could possibly be accused of. And so we saw in the video a couple of breaks taken, but they were of utility to the police as well, because as we found out then when we came back from the breaks, they were waiting for the results of this DNA test, this physical buccal swab DNA test that had been taken from Mr. Edwards during the interview. And obviously, we know more about DNA than probably anyone in Perth now. That's not just a vending machine job. That takes some time, but it didn't take that long. As you said, Nat, around about 12 or 13 hours over the course of the interview, and the swab was only taken a couple of hours in. But when they came back, it really did appear to me that Detective Marrapodi took on a little bit of a tougher edge after that break, because they had the results that they were waiting for, and they were the results that they wanted. In that the buccal swab that Mr. Edwards had provided was also a match to the DNA from Ciara, the DNA from Karrakatta, and the DNA from Huntingdale. And so you can see and certainly hear Detective Marrapodi is armed now with this last link in the chain that he can then go to Mr. Edwards, and that is what he says: brace yourself, Bradley, because we have got some results back. And those results, he told Mr. Edwards in the interview, were a match to all three. And again, Mr. Edwards' immediate response is, well, that's impossible. I don't know how that can be. How can that be? Was his immediate response. And then it is put to him again and again, and in various ways, personal and psychological, I suppose, or emotional, and from an intelligence point of view, in terms of the police officers. Well, we've talked about your education, Bradley. You remember that back earlier in the interview. We know you're not a dumb man, or you're no dummy. So you must understand what this means. And again, we see Mr. Edwards struggling to come to terms with what he is being accused of.
And when you're watching that video, Ali, is he showing emotion at this point?
Absolutely. That was the first time he actually showed any emotion. He put his hand up to his head and rubbed his forehead, and then he put his head down. He was silent for a good few seconds, and then you could hear him like coughing or sighing, and then he looked up. And then they said, do you understand what we're talking about? And he said, yes, I do understand. And he's saying, yes, it is your DNA. He said, yes, I understand that, but it wasn't me. But that was the only time that he actually stopped talking and put his head down and rubbed his face with his hand.
And is it clear that he does understand the ramifications of what is being put to him? Because they then go on to say, well, your DNA has been matched to the DNA obtained from a victim of this rape.
And that's when the police confront Mr. Edwards with physical, I don't want to say props, because they're not props. There was a photo of the kimono. There was the photo of the victim, of the bedroom in Huntingdale, and then tellingly there was a photo of Ciara Glennon that was placed before Mr. Edwards, and he was very then starkly confronted with what the police were accusing him of: rape and murder. And Detective Marrapodi spelled out, really, in particularly when describing what had happened to Ciara. 14th of March, abducted from Claremont, dumped in Eglinton, murdered. What have you got to say for yourself, and why would your DNA be on her? And Mr. Edwards, again, he really struggled to elucidate what was being put to him, really. I don't know. How can that be? I really don't know what to say to you. And then the police used another tactic, which I'm hoping Damien might elucidate on, in that they then brought Mr. Edwards' personal life into the questioning, in particular by saying to him, your daughter tells us that honesty is your biggest or most valuable virtue. That's what you you pride yourself on. So prove her right. Tell us what happened, Bradley. Which again was an interesting way of asking a very similar question, I suppose, but coming at it from a different angle, I suppose, to try and get a different response, emotional or verbal.
Is that something that you've seen in terms of how a police interview would go, Damien?
Absolutely. I think, and if you think about it logically, what the police are trying to do is get answers to questions they have. And we always, well, I know from my side of the fence, we always think to ourselves, oh, the police are just trying to secure the conviction. But it's not actually the case. They're just trying to get answers. So they're just trying to find out what they can find out. And so by bringing in your daughter, and anyone who's a parent will understand that that's tapping at the very heartstrings of your whole existence, the soul of who you are. So we're going to give this person the opportunity to consider who he is as a father, and that person, his daughter, considers that he's an honest person. Now, if you didn't do it, if you were innocent of the crime, you would be okay when that was said to you. You would sit there and go, well, and I mean, from what I understand, Mr. Edwards' response to that was in line with, consistent with him being innocent. From what I understand, and obviously I wasn't there, but the point is that if you're just trying to provide someone with an opportunity, and I'm being very kind by using the word opportunity, if the police are just trying to provide the most open opportunity for a person to admit something they might have done, then it's a tactic that people would understand would work to bring up your family, to bring up your kids. What about your kids? Your kids tell us that you're a really honest person, and that really is going to encourage someone to be as honest as they can. And it's a very effective tactic, as anyone who's a parent would understand.
Yeah.
Well, actually, in his response, Bradley Edwards kept saying, I am being honest. And yes, I do accept responsibility for things that I've done, but I haven't done this. So much so that it sort of, the detectives then said, well, you are an educator. You did have an education. You went up to year 12. You've done an apprenticeship, because it was like Edwards was in another dimension with his replies. And I think that prompted the police to say, well, you do understand, which they did repeatedly say, you do understand what you're being asked. You do understand what all of this means. And he responded, yes, I don't know, but I don't know about any of this stuff. Even to do with the DNA, they explicitly explained what the DNA was. That unless you've got an identical twin, you're the only person in the world that this matches. They explained about the sperm that was left on the victim. He understood that, but he kept saying, I didn't do it. So he never wavered in as far as that went.
Tim, you mentioned that Detective Marrapodi shows Bradley Edwards the photos, and one of the photos is of Ciara Glennon. What does he ask him about that photo when he shows it to him?
Well, I mean, as I say, it was very clear what the allegation was by this time, and as the photo is slid over the table, he said, "This is Ciara Glennon," and basically, again, confronts him with another level of interrogation, I suppose, asking him to look at the picture of this young woman who was so brutally killed.
Does he say, he ask her, do you know who she is?
Yes. Have you met her? Have you seen her? Do you know who she is? Again, a roundabout way of trying to get to what they hoped, I suppose, Mr. Edwards would tell them or say or explain. But once again, once he appeared to have acknowledged that, he didn't give much away. It was, I suppose, a tactic or a response that the police had become used to over those 12 hours, because that was his response to many of their questions. Yeah.
I'm curious also, Ali, about, Mr. Edwards is in the dock today. He's watching this videotape. What's his reaction to what he's watching today?
Totally bland, just as he's been all along. And even his tone of voice in the actual interview with the police was, I'm trying to help you. I wish I could help. I just don't know what you're talking about. I was trying to do everything to help you. And today he just looked on as he's listening to this. There's no reaction at all. There hasn't been very much. At one stage he handed some notes to his lawyer, but that was during a break. But apart from that, there's been no change in his attitude the whole 6-7 months that we've been sitting there.
Yeah.
Completely bland. Like he's in another world to me.
Tim, the other photo that he's shown is of the kimono, which is left behind at the Huntingdale attack in 88. What does Detective Marrapodi ask him about this kimono, and what are his responses to that?
Yeah, well, once again, he's directly questioned, this is a kimono that was found at that scene. Had you worn it? Can you explain how your DNA can be on all over it, not just in one part of it, but all over it? Have you seen it before? And again, no, it's not mine. I've never seen it. Why would I wear it? Just flat denials when the allegations are put so directly, but then when they're put in a different way, they're a slightly different answer, but the tenet of the answer is the same to all the allegations at this stage. It wasn't me. I don't know. I wish I could help you, but I can't.
Yeah. Damien, this is, a part of this case that has absolutely fascinated people because, as we discussed yesterday, we know that this is an absolute lie and that Mr. Edwards has later pleaded guilty to, the Huntingdale and the Karrakatta attacks on the eve of the trial. What do you make of it and what people will make of that?
It leaves me a bit speechless, Nat. Every time I think about it, on a personal level, I'm a little lost in where my thinking could or should go, and considering I'm likely to be more forgiving of an accused person than the average person is. Most people wouldn't feel the way that I do. I understand that. But legally speaking, the biggest issue that I think that it presents for the accused in this case is, and it's not rocket science, it's his credibility. So, I mean, he hasn't given any evidence, so his credibility in regards of him giving evidence is not going to come into question, but he has done a record of interview in where he's, ultimately denied any knowledge or anything to do with any of these three charges that are brought before him at the moment, and the question is, what weight will the judge give to lies that he's seen him tell in the interview against what he's asking the judiciary to consider as truth?
Yeah.
So if you think about the context of the interview, Ali and Tim did. Am I understanding that during the course of that interview he was asked about the Karrakatta and the Huntingdale offences?
He was, yes.
And he denied both of those?
Yes, and just exactly the same flat tone that he denied everything else. No surprise, no indignation, nothing, just bland.
Right, so obviously the issue for any person in that situation is, to some extent, they've given up a bit of their credibility. And I mean, some people will say they've given up all their credibility, but I'm not of that view. I think that it's not impossible for someone to be untruthful about one thing and be truthful about another. But obviously I understand that the case will be that you eat into your credibility as soon as you start to be anything but honest and completely honest. So I think it's quite logical that people will be able to see that that's the issue that arises, from this interview in terms of what the judiciary can take from it and how they use it.
Yeah. And Ali and Tim, you're sitting here watching this interview and you're watching the answers to these questions and the emphatic denials, and I have no idea how that happened, I have nothing to do with it. And of course you already know the answers are lies. Is it almost surreal while you're sitting watching this play out?
Well, I've said all along it's like something from a movie. I kept expecting him to talk about himself in the third person maybe, because his denials weren't even that emphatic. They were just, no, I don't know, no, I wish I could help you. They weren't like sort of an angry denial or an upset denial in that way. And as I said, it was almost a simplistic way he was answering.
I was trying to discern whether you could tell whether there was any difference in the way he was making those denials in terms of intonation, body language, whether his voice cracked or went up or down or stayed more level when he was talking about the murders. And I've got to say, I couldn't discern any difference. The tone of the interview from Mr. Edwards was pretty consistent throughout the whole thing. He got tired at points, obviously. His voice got a bit croaky. He got a little bit emotional at some points. His voice was raised slightly, but overall, you would say he was pretty consistent, so that was the one thing I was looking for. The other thing I was looking for today was I was trying to gauge the two young women that did attack, and I was trying to watch their reaction as they were listening to Mr. Edwards deny any knowledge of the attacks against them at all. And again, to their credit, they've been all the families involved, and I'll include Mr. Edwards' parents in that as well. Everyone's just conducted themselves with such dignity and stoicism and calm in the face of what must have been an absolutely horrendous, traumatic and very, very taxing 6 months or so.
Yeah, I mean, and you're right, because, we do see with court cases that tempers flare and emotions boil over, and we see sometimes some really terrible scenes outside courtrooms. And given the enormity of this trial, we've seen none of that.
No, quite the opposite, actually. There's been since Christmas or towards the end, as the case has been coming towards its end, you can sort of feel the weight lifting off everyone, I think, a little bit, particularly police, prosecutors, lawyers, court staff. I feel everyone has sort of really started to think, well, we've got through it, and now we are right at the end of what has been an absolute marathon.
Yeah. So then the video comes to an end, and this is around 11:30 that night, the day of the arrest. So we're now talking some 16 hours since he's been taken into custody, and at this point the charges are read out to him. What's his reaction to that?
He appeared to break a little bit, I have to say, I think. So the process is that Detective Marrapodi explains to Mr. Edwards, I'm going to just go and consult with the senior officer because I have to before I actually formally prefer these charges against you. And then he listed all the charges that were going to be preferred against him, and they were all of them apart from the murder of Ciara. That charge didn't come formally until much, much later, nearly 2 years later in the process. He was slumped in his chair. He looked tired. He looked exhausted, and I've got to say, he looked very similar to the demeanour that I saw him then, almost 12 hours later when he appeared in court. Because we've talked to the photographers that got the shot of Mr. Edwards being taken out of that Hatch building, which was where this interview was. He would then have been taken to the holding cells at Perth Magistrates Court, brought up before us. And that's where officially, I suppose, this case really started. But I mean, once again, it was just an extraordinary end to an extraordinary interview at the end of an extraordinary case. Yeah.
Has his physical appearance changed much from that video interview to today?
Well, not really. That interview, he was just in casual clothes, and the interview went right through, as you say, right through to 11:30 at night or so. But no, he could almost, looking at him in court, it's almost like a cardboard cutout. It's just he doesn't show any emotion. To me, I've never seen anyone sit that long for so many months and not show anything at all, expression-wise, no shaking of the head, nothing. And even during the interview, it was his responses to, did you murder these women? Did you cause this rape? Were about the same tone as when he was asked what sports he played. It was just a monotone.
Damien, is it sometimes that people will save their emotional reactions for when they're not standing or sitting in the dock?
I think sometimes it's a case that it's not that dissimilar to a batsman in cricket. You know, they know that the etiquette. They walk off the field and then the change rooms, they're throwing the bat around. I mean, I think that it would be understandable that a person in this person's situation would sit there and remain fairly calm, and then potentially, you can imagine in his bed of the night time he'd be upset and potentially crying, and there's any number of emotions that might be going on. But I thought that if I didn't expect anything else, when this case started, I didn't expect that there would be a flurry of emotions from the accused person.
Yeah. So that basically, the ending of that interview pretty much wrapped up the state's case. But Tim, then Carmel Barbagallo dropped a bit of a bombshell.
Yeah. So there was a few questions in cross-examination, but obviously Detective Marrapodi's evidence pretty much spoke for itself, or the screen spoke for him. And then, so that was the end of the case for the prosecution, which was a momentous moment in itself after 85 days. And then Justice Hall asked Ms Barbagallo a series of supposedly housekeeping questions, and one of those was, can you please read the email that you sent to the court regarding your emotional upset argument? Now, rewind about 4.5 months.
Yes.
This was basically the prosecution's theory as to motive. This was Mr. Edwards was going through emotional turmoil at the very precise points in time that Jane, Ciara and Sarah were murdered, and stretching that out a little bit to Karrakatta as well. And we heard this evidence, and we've pondered how the judge might think about this evidence. But it turns out we're not going to have to worry about that evidence at all, because Ms Barbagallo has taken the position, or the DPP team led by Ms Barbagallo has taken the position that they're not going to argue about that motive. They're not going to put that before the judge as a consideration, with a caveat in that certain sections of that evidence will be used in other ways. So, for instance, the fact that Mr. Edwards' first wife moved out of the marital home around January 1996, they're not going to say now that emotionally provoked Mr. Edwards into going out and snatching Sarah off the street. But what they are going to say is that provided Mr. Edwards an opportunity to do that, because he was then home alone. We've heard from other witnesses say he took that breakup pretty hard, so he was drinking. His nighttime activities, we know those about the computers, and how he didn't sleep much after dark. So what the prosecution are going to do, and Ms Barbagallo detailed this in court by reading out this email, is to take certain parts of that background, if you like, and use it in other ways to show propensity, opportunity, and do it that way, rather than ask the judge to draw a line or a bow that it all wraps together as the possible motive.
Damien, is this a little bit of semantics in that, I mean, we're not going to call it emotional upset, but still taking those key points and using them in another way?
I think it is, Nat. I think that it's my view is always that it doesn't matter how many times someone says, well, this is not relevant, or it's been objected to, or a judiciary says, well, we're not allowing it in. It doesn't change the fact that it's before the court. It doesn't change the fact that it's something that's been raised, it's been discussed, even if it's been excluded, it's before the court. But as we've said before, I think that with His Honour in this case, I don't think there's anything for the people of Western Australia to fear. I think he's, if anyone, he's the one with the power to compartmentalise it and put it away.
Yeah. And Justice Hall also said he was unlikely to take into account the homicide patterns evidence. So what did he say about that?
Yeah, so that is the evidence that we heard earlier this week regarding the filters that were put on all the murders in Western Australia over the last 25, 30 years, and then honing them down. And he said Justice Hall gave an initial ruling on that, I suppose you could call it, but it was pretty emphatic, and I don't think it'll change much in the weeks and months to come. And he said basically he wasn't comfortable that helped him decide whether one person was responsible for these murders or not. He said it was... I found it quite interesting, and whether he did or not, I'm not sure. But he said it wasn't helpful to him, in his view. He invited Ms. Barbagallo to make more submissions on that if she wished to, and not straight away, so she might do in the weeks to come. But his initial view was that he wouldn't be taking that into account either.
Yeah, and Damien, you said that you couldn't see the relevance of that at all.
Well, when we finished the podcast whenever it was, that the last time I was fortunate enough to hang out with you people and do this, I got off the podcast and I remember thinking to myself, I was trying to piece together, if I was making the decision, how it would help me. And I in the end, I put the thought away because I couldn't come to any conclusion. So it relieves, I take some relief from that on two fronts. One is that the person that I would consider one of the greatest thinking minds in law in WA thought something similar, and that I wasn't just lost in what the information was, because the information, and Tim presented it very well. I mean, because obviously I wasn't there in court, but he presented it very well. So it wasn't like it was confusing in its presentation. It's just confusing in how you can draw anything conclusive from that. So, as I said the other day, I'm not sure that I could have found any way to utilise it if I was trying to draw a picture that would assist me to find that one person had committed these crimes.
Do you wonder if this could in any way have a relevance for the case in relation to Sarah Spears?
Absolutely, I do. I don't wonder. When I think about the case for Sarah, I'm often left wondering, and that's all I'm going to say about that. I'm often left a little bit without an answer. So, given that this, in relation to the homicide patterns evidence, does it tell us that, and I don't know the answer to this, I just pose the question, does it tell us that the prosecution felt the same way and they're trying to find some other way to firm up what they're a bit concerned about? I don't know the answer to that, but it's a question that went through my mind, and I wonder whether Sarah's case sits at the top of that pile.
Yeah, and it's the same. I mean, I don't think any of us really know, but I guess, Tim, do you think that for Sarah's family this could be seen as a blow?
Possibly. But, I mean, how big a blow could it be after, losing a loved one? I mean, obviously, look, there are 3 murder cases, 3 murder charges, and 3 trials going on in one, essentially. And I think Damien's very fair in his assessment that the case concerning Sarah is where there is the least amount of direct evidence. You've got to say that because obviously there are no physical remains for a start. There were no sightings on the night apart from these screams and the possible sighting of the car from the area of those screams. So it will be one of Miss Barbagallo's major tasks, I would suggest, when she comes to do her closings in a month, to draw all the straws together to make a cogent and the strongest possible argument she can that all 3 were committed by the one person. Yeah.
Well, then came the moment that so many people had been waiting for, and Ali, this was when Justice Hall asked Mr. Edwards if he would like to give evidence at his own trial, and what was his response?
His response was no, and he was asked about having evidence brought in. He said absolutely no, he was not going to give evidence, and this threw me completely because everything happened so quick. We thought it was going to go on for another week. And all of a sudden, I said to Tim, "Did I hear right? Is that it now?" I mean, it just seemed to come very, very fast. Those last closing remarks today, and that was it. After that.
That's right. It did happen very quickly, because obviously what happened after that was Mr. Jovic then delivered one of the most startling moments of the trial, where he stood up and pretty much within a matter of minutes closed.
Yeah. So two things there. Mr. Edwards was actually asked personally by the judge. Now, Damien, does that usually happen? Does a judge actually ask the accused whether they want evidence, whether they're personally going to give evidence?
I think it's important to note in terms of accused people giving evidence, Tim, that in the last couple of years there's been specifically one case where there was some issues about counsel giving, or let me put it this way, there was some issues about whether an accused gave evidence or not. And so the rules have tightened up on that. So I don't think it's common for a judge or a magistrate to direct the question directly at an accused, but given the environment this trial's taken place in, it doesn't surprise me that he did that.
Yeah, and that's exactly what he said. He said to Mr. Jovic, given the import, the interest, the weight, however, the size, scale of the trial, I'm going to do that. I'm going to ask Mr. Edwards to stand up, and I'm going to direct him personally, or question him, or ask him that question directly, which he did. And as Ali said, no, Your Honour, that was the answer. Now, that, I've got to say, that was the answer that most of us were anticipating.
Yeah.
The way one very learned judge put to me today outside court was, his position as it stands today is as good as it's going to get, and the possibility of taking the stand, you can only harm yourself, because you're going to put yourself up against cross-examination against one of the very, very senior barristers in the country, and what good could come of that possibly? So, but that's my take on it. That's my opinion, and I don't know, obviously, anything that's gone on between Mr. Edwards and his counsel.
Yeah.
But what we weren't expecting then was Mr. Jovic to stand up and say, "Yes, well, I'm going to present some evidence." Place one sheet of temperatures from the Perth suburb of Gosnells in 1996 before the judge, and then close his case.
Yes.
And I would struggle to find anyone in that court, possibly Mr. Barbara Gallo would have had an idea. But anyone in the back of the court, it was a little bit surreal, having spent 85 days. I think we're up to about page 10,200 of the transcripts for it to end like that. It was a bit of an anticlimax, I've got to say, but a climax nonetheless. And we were trying to work out, well, why has that happened? What has happened there? And we probably won't get that many answers, although
Tim, I had to ask you 3 times.
Is that really it?
Yeah, is that it? Yes.
What just happened there?
Well, because I guess
there's a famous story about Bob Geldof, the organiser of Live Aid. Apparently when Live Aid was all over, he walked out onto the stage at Wembley Stadium to just take it all in after this whirlwind of Live Aid. And apparently there was one gentleman still leaning over the barrier and just shouted up to Bob Geldof, "Is that it?" at the end of Live Aid. And Bob Geldof actually made that was his title of his autobiography, and that's what it felt a little bit like that today at the end of the Lord Mayor's parade. But we talked a lot about fibre evidence, and I've mentioned the defence fibre expert a lot, because that's one of the main bits of the defence I suppose we were anticipating.
And Tim?
And he didn't come. He didn't come today. Now, my understanding is that report that was tendered and we waited for, and the prosecution was given just before Christmas, and the judge, and there was this, that, and that, back and forth about it. My understanding is that report perhaps wasn't as helpful to the defence case as they'd hoped it would be, and so they've decided to not put it before the court, because if it was, then obviously the prosecution have the right to call that expert and question him on it. And
it might not be to their advantage.
Correct. So that was my understanding. And so there we were. It was then after the nightclub, the lights came on, the balloons sort of fell away, and there we were outside wondering what we're going to do for the next 4 weeks.
Damien, can you make any sense of this to in a trial like this for the defence not to call a single witness?
Well, I think what Tim's alluded to before, that it was said to him by somebody outside the court, was that it might simply be the view that the defence are of the view that this is the position we're in at the moment is as good as it's going to get. Now that sounds like a relatively conservative position, but you can actually look at it from the other way as well, because the reason we're in the best position we could ever get is because the prosecution haven't done what they should have done. You just see what I mean? You can look at it. There's two different ways to look at that. It could be the case that you can't make it any better, or it could be the case that the defence are of the view that the prosecution haven't proved beyond a reasonable doubt. And I certainly wouldn't allude to either of those because I have no idea. But I think that the fact that no evidence has been offered except the temperatures for the city of Gosnells, which is something I should say should be on trial in itself, is that how confident must you be to end your case like that? You must be terribly confident. I'm not talking about confidence that you will be acquitted, but confidence that the position you are in at the moment is the best position you can be in. If you think about it, all those discussions that we've had when I've joined you guys in the Conversation podcast, we've talked about how there's sometimes a very important element of making sure that you protect your interest against appeal. And when I say your interest, like if you're a lawyer, the party you're acting for, and if you're the judge, your decision or wwhatever it is. How confident must the defence be in their position? Not that necessarily he'll be acquitted, but their position in what they think, where they think they're at, that they've closed their case that way. That's certainly one way to look at it.
Yeah. And it also goes to what we've tried to stress over the course of the trial, is that the defence don't have to prove anything. They just put the prosecution to proof. They stand up and say, right, okay, just give us what you've got, and then let the judge make the decision. And so a lot of Mr. Jovich's work has obviously been done in cross-examining key witnesses and trying to cast doubt on key parts of the evidence, DNA and fibres being sort of two of those major planks.
Well, Tim, I think it's important for people to recognise as well that just because the defence didn't really run a case, so to speak, it doesn't mean that the defence didn't prepare a case. So there would have been, a bucket load of work done preparing the case, because you have to prepare the case to have a look at it to see whether you should run it. And so, you don't know what the prosecution's position is going to be until their case finishes. You might have an idea, but anything could happen along that journey. So you need, when you're preparing for a defence, you need to prepare it as if you were going to run it, in its full extent. And there's a lot of work that goes into that. And just in saying that, a thought that came to my mind, Nat and Ali, is that if a lot of listeners will be thinking to themselves, this is just my thought, I think a lot of listeners will be saying to themselves, well, if you were innocent, surely you would get into the box and you would tell the judge you were innocent. And it's a very, very difficult concept to move around. But in my experience, there are so many things that can happen to you in cross-examination that even when I'm convinced that one of my clients is innocent and I'm convinced that they can tell a good story, I'm always extremely mindful of what can happen in cross-examination. So I think that it would be dangerous for, obviously listeners have got to form their own views as every day goes by. But
Damien, I've always thought that too, but I think this was a jury trial, that definitely would have held, but a judge always emphasises you cannot take anything into whether the defendant agrees to give evidence or not. They really emphasise that, but I've always thought that a juror the common man or woman would think, well, if that was me and I was innocent, I'd be getting up there and yelling their head off. And I wonder too if that's why the judge asked the question direct to Bradley Edwards about whether he was giving evidence, because you often hear defendants say, "Oh, my lawyer told me not to," and da 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 da. So I'm just thinking.
I think
about
that's
whether that
I think that's precisely why he wanted there to be absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind that he'd given Mr. Edwards the clearest instructions and an opportunity to do that. He gave Mr. Jovic the break to explain that he was going to do that to Mr. Edwards. And as Damien said, there's been a high-profile murder case here that's just wrapped up in the appeal court recently, and that was the exact appealed argument that the lady that was convicted of that murder basically said, well, I thought I was going to give evidence. My lawyer didn't instruct me properly, and that's where the confusion lay. So again, Justice Hall just doing everything he possibly can to make sure everything is done to the
letter of the law.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Ali, did anyone have anything to say to the TV cameras outside court today when it adjourned?
No, because they do realise, of course, we're still in the middle of it. I mean, they've got this closing submission, so. But they were asked if they wanted to say anything. No one said anything at all. They just politely said, no, we can't comment.
Yes.
And, yeah.
As expected. Tim, what happens next?
So, again, Justice Hall full of planning, full of plans. So he's given both sides 4 weeks to come up with their written closing submissions. So that is the submissions that will be handed up to Justice Hall in written form, pulling together both sides of the argument. And then both sides will then be given the chance to talk to those or make oral arguments that just stress and emphasise the main points of those written submissions. So that will begin on June the 8th, go for a few days, and then the trial will officially be over, and the judge will go away to think about his verdict and, most importantly, do his written reasons for coming to that verdict. Written reasons are only given in judge-alone trials. They're hugely sought after, particularly in big trials, because not only is it the outcome, but it's also the legal thinking behind that outcome. So not only will us scummy media types be reading it from cover to cover, but I'm pretty sure every lawyer and jurist and judge in the country will also be giving it a good bash as well.
And the people who are following this case so very closely. So as Tim mentioned, that's 4 weeks for the adjournment, which means we will come back on the 8th of June, which is coincidentally the day of Jane Rimmer's disappearance. That is the day prosecution will begin its closing submission. So thank you, everyone. Tim, Ali, Damien, Brendan, and all the guests we've had on the podcast so far. It has been a marathon 6 months, and thank you for your company during that time. Keep an eye out for bonus episodes during our 4-week adjournment. You can keep in touch with us at clermontpodcast@wanews.com.au, and we will endeavour to get back to you. Until then, that wraps up Week 21. We'll be back with you in 4 weeks' time for Day 86 of Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast is hosted by Natalie Bonjolo, produced by Kate Ryan, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au. And if local news delivered differently appeals to you, tune into WA's newest morning show, The West Live with Jenna Clark. It's talkback radio, but without the interruptions. Listen live weekdays from 8:45 a.m. on thewest.com.au or catch up with the podcast.